in a generalized way, not the specific situation in which it happened.
Well, it's very, very interesting. I mean, I think that, I'll tell you a little story. When I was a kid, I had this vision of myself as being a journalist, specifically a foreign correspondent. I don't know, I must have seen movies or something about foreign correspondents and thought that, they were cool or something. So anyway, during my junior year of high school, I went to Northwestern University for the summer for a little summer course in journalism for kids my age. And it soon became very clear that even though I was not a bad writer, I was not a very good reporter. Right? And why wasn't I a very good reporter? Because I wasn't very good at asking questions of people. I was way too polite. So I wouldn't want to sort of push my way to the front and ask a question. I wouldn't ask people unpleasant things. So clearly journalism was not going to be my job. But I do think, right, that's been one of the challenges over my life is trying to figure out, well, when do you ask the hard question, right? Because sometimes that's what people need.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes that's what's necessary in a particular situation is to be pushed a little bit. So I tend to be a little bit better at pulling rather than pushing, but we each have our own style. But I do think, right, that there is a place for asking questions, even difficult questions, and even in circumstances that might seem maybe not entirely appropriate. But let's see what Georgie. And anyway, if you're a philosopher and your dad is dying, you might ask different questions than if you were not a philosopher. So, all right, so let's see. So just a few days before my father died in 2014, I asked him a question that some might find insensitive or inappropriate. He's a philosopher, he just says things, right? So, what are your thoughts now about dying? Interesting, right now. We were in the hospital. My father had not spoken much all that day. He was under the influence of painkillers and had begun the active stage of dying. I don't necessarily think that question is inappropriate or insensitive, but I think it may have been mistimed. Someone who is already in active dying and also, under the influence of morphine, probably isn't going to be able to say very much. And if he had been able to ask that question a little bit earlier, he probably would have gotten more.
But
So
when do you, sorry,
yeah,
when do you, as the rabbi, make that final blessing?
it depends.
Do you ask
It depends.
the
It depends on the person. And
they
this,
want that?
right, this is actually, so what Connie is talking about is it's the vidui, which is the final confession that in the Jewish tradition people say right before they die. And so what I have often found is that people are not ready to say the vidui, and so sometimes they're not ready until it's too late for them to say it.
Mhm.
And so I end up saying it for them. Right? There's a form of the vidui that the rabbi or whoever happens to be with the person at their bedside says for the person. And it basically is an opportunity to say, I know I wasn't perfect. I hope that everything is okay. And you say the Shema, right, which in Judaism is the affirmation, and Christianity too, right, the affirmation of the oneness of God, right, and that's basically the vidui. But yes, it can be difficult, right, to ask a person. I actually had that situation this week. The reason I'm so verklempt today is because I just came from a funeral of a guy that was in my congregation in Cambridge, and he died on Monday. The hospital called me at 3 a.m. on Monday morning saying, we don't think he's going to live for very long. Would you come in and say the final blessing? I said, okay. Actually, they asked me if I would just talk to him on the telephone. I said, no, I'll come in. I was awake at that, they woke me up, so I was awake. So I went in and I had to ask the guy, was he ready to say the Vidui? No, not really. And so, less than 12 hours later, he was dead, right? So there never really was a chance for him to say it because he wasn't ready, right? So this is, it's not uncommon for people to not be ready. But you do have to ask, right? Because you want to make sure people have a chance, yeah.
Is that a specific prayer that you use? I mean, it's already written out.
Well, it's actually, that's a great question. It is a specific genre of prayer. And there are several versions of it that float around.
So you're not asking the person to put it in their own words.
No, if they want to, then that is completely fine. But it's not assumed that someone will come up with the formula for that on their own.
Thank you.
And there's a whole variety of them out there. I had a congregant once. He didn't like the one that I had brought because it was from the conservative movement. He wanted the one from Orthodoxy, so I had to go looking and find that one for him. And he wanted to say it for him. He actually asked me for it, right? That's the variety of ways people approach this. Yeah, go ahead, Erin.
It seems to me that it's almost too late at the point of a person in the process of dying. The painkillers, the emotions, et cetera. I would think that these conversations would have been had much before that within the family.
Well, that I think is a great point, Harriet. And I think that I don't know, of course, because I am only alive today in this context, in this culture, but in this culture, which tends to be very phobic of death, we don't really like to talk about it. We don't like to acknowledge it. We can intellectually acknowledge, yeah, sure, someday I'm going to die, right? But it's very hard, right, to actually come emotionally to terms with the fact.
I didn't understand her question.
I think her question was, if I understood it, and Harriet, tell me if I'm wrong.
I
Well,
will.
we do have the microphone.
You couldn't understand it because of the microphone.
Right.
Got it. Harriet, why don't you ask your question again?
We have a microphone.
You have to hold
Notice,
it.
everybody, he has a microphone that we don't get during the short story
You
time.
have to hold it right up. so
This
your
is brand
voice-
new.
Oh, this is-
It was just fixed.
Yeah,
This is
So this
brand new,
belongs to.
brand new today.
Hooray.
up further,
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
sort of.
Okay, I was wondering why this conversation is taking place at deathbed. I would have thought that in a family, one would have talked about everything, and certainly in my family, we do. I mean, I kid one of my grandsons about anytime he sees a sunset, that's where I'm gonna be. And so we, it's not we're serious and crying and wring your hands. That's inappropriate, I think, particularly for the grandchildren, maybe for the kids, but for the grandchildren, no. So there's a lightness to it, but we certainly have gone to that edge and talked about things. So that's all I wanted to.
Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
Thank you.
Oh, actually, let's do the honors here.
So I brought with me this pamphlet called Your Conversation Starter Kit. When it comes to the end of life care, talking matters. It's put out by the Conversation Project from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement.
Yeah, no, so I think, Harriet, it sounds to me like your family is unusual in the context of American culture. That it's not that typical for families to have these kinds of conversations.
Well, they have young grandparents, so they just don't anticipate it happening for a long time.
well, part of it depends on what kind of kids you have, right? If you have kids who are very curious and unafraid of questions like my younger son, right? You're going to have a certain type of conversation with him. If we have kids who are more like my older son and a little bit less comfortable with things like this, right? You might not have those same kind of conversations quite as easily. So it's and in each family is very, very different, right? So I don't want to say that George Yancey never had this conversation with his father before, right? He's only telling us about what happened when
It
his.
almost sounds as if he has.
Yeah, it seems like it was another, because he says now, what do you think now about it, right? Because, so maybe he had his, so anyway, he said it's too complex. These were his final spoken words to me before he died. I had anticipated something more pensive, something more drawn out, but they were consistent with our mutual grappling with the meaning of death. Until the very end, he spoke with honesty, courage, and wisdom. I have known many who have taken the mystery out of death through a kind of sociological matter of factness.
Sounds terrible.
Sociological matter of factness?
The whole thing sounds so terrible to me. It's
What
not
in-
at all delicate.
Say it again?
It's not at all delicate.
By the whole thing, she means talking
Yeah, the
about
whole,
death.
when my husband was dying, my big concern was that he wouldn't think about dying. Because what is there to think about? You have nothing to do about it. But
I mean, once you're dead, you have nothing to
so
do.
you're all going to be shocked when I started to read an article from the newspaper that we were both interested in. Stroking his cheek, it's, you know, I don't like too much manipulation in my life.
Yes, well, I mean, I think you're raising a very important point, right? Which is that each, you know, it's easy for people to say, oh, we should be more open about death, right? We have a whole institute, right? The Conversation Project, dedicated to getting people to talk about the reality that they're going to die. They have a particular reason for that, right? Which is that too many people don't acknowledge that they're going to die. And so they end up in the hospital without any idea of what they want, right? And then they end up very often, right, having heroic measures to keep them alive, right? Which no one wants, but in the absence of any guidance, right, the hospitals have to do. You go ahead.
Does this happen as often with older people, or is it more with younger people who are more unwilling to deal with it?
All people. I mean, in terms of the Conversation Project thing,
Oh,
in terms of the Conversation Project thing, it's everybody, right? It's everybody. You know, not enough people have healthcare proxies, not enough people, you know, so that. But I think what you're talking about, right, is that each person and each family has their own culture around death, right?
What about Jim?
Yes,
I
go
just,
ahead, Ann.
I've been with quite a few people who have died. And when my second husband was dying, I didn't want him to be lonely with dying. I wanted to be with him. And
Yes.
we kind of did it together. And at the very end, he said to me, I couldn't have done this without you.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
and I
beautiful.
think
Ann.
it's more
What
about
expensive.
how you say it than you know, I don't think, you know, you're going to say, how do you feel about croaking over exactly?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that, you know, and I think that what you just articulated, Ann, is exactly what Ruth was articulating, right? Which is that at the moment of her husband's death, she was with him, right? And she chose the way to be with him that she felt was the most appropriate for him and for her,
Yeah.
right? And so that was.
I didn't dare say for me. I was thinking only of him.
Right, but it had to work for you also, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to do it, right?
Right.
So it's, you know, so because you said you read an article that you were both interested in, right? So it was
Yes.
something about being really with him, right, in
And
that
that he
moment.
was still alive.
And he was alive, and he was alive until he wasn't,
Yeah.
right? And so, and Ann and her husband had a different way of doing it, right? And I think that that's what's really important, right? Is that each person, there are people, I work with people who don't want to tell their parent that they're dying because they're afraid that's going to bum them out.
Yeah.
There are other people who, if they think that their kid is trying to pretend that they're not dying, they get very angry. What are you trying to do, pretending that I'm not dying? Of course I'm dying, right? So each person has their own way about it. So, all right, Sandy, did you want to say something?
I'll keep quiet right now.
Okay.
There are so many different ways of dealing with it.
100%. Right. And I think it's very easy, right? It's very easy to second guess other people's ways of dealing with it. And it's also very easy to second guess our own way of dealing with it, right? I arrived back at the hospital on Monday after finishing my class here, and my congregant had already died. And I thought to myself, boy, if I had realized that he was really going to be dead in 12 hours, I would have made a point, right, of giving the nurse my phone number and I would have canceled the class and whatever, blah. But you can't, right? Because you only do what you think is the right thing in the moment. But anyway, let's pull back from that just for a minute. I'm happy to talk about these things. This is very important things to talk about. Let's get back to the article, right? And we'll see what their conversations were. And I do think that there's some value, right, to broaching these conversations with your loved one, if only to see if it's something they're willing to talk about, right? Because if they say, I don't want to talk about it, okay, that's good information, right? It's good information. It's good information to know how you might approach the topic when the reality comes along, right? Okay. All right, so I have known many who have taken the mystery out of death through a kind of sociological matter-of-factness. We will all die at some point. Tell me something I don't know, right? A lot of people will tell me when someone maybe their husband or their wife or someone has died, and I'm thinking of Russian speakers over at they say. There's nothing you can do. Right? There's nothing you can do. It's just the way it is, the way of the world, right? Got to live with it. Right? I suspect that many of these same people have also taken the mystery out of being alive, out of the fact that we exist. But of course I exist. I'm right here, aren't I? So I'm not sure I agree with George Yancey about this. I think that people are much more willing to take the mystery out of death than they are to take the mystery out of life. But again, I like to disagree with him. So confronting the reality of death and trying to understand its uncanny nature is part of what I do as a philosopher and as a human being. My father, while not a professional philosopher, loved wisdom and had the gift of gab. Our many conversations over the years touched on the existence of God, the meaning of love, and yes, the fact of death. In retrospect, my father and I refused to allow death to have the final word without first metaphorically staring it in the face. We were both rebelling against the ways in which so many hide from facing the fact that consciousness as we know it will stop. Poof. Right? When we die, that's it, right? And it's not necessarily, right, that there's nothing after we die, it's that we don't know, right? We just don't know what happens after we die. So the poof there's all kinds of poofs. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I don't agree with your last statement, but when we die, and that's it. A piece of us is left in each one of our progeny. And they witness that in each other, and they take great, one of my machatonim died recently, and each one of the grandchildren spoke at the Devaya, and each one had something special to say about their connection, and they had reestablished that connection in the days that he was dying. So the person's dying, that's just the physical aspect of it. But the spiritual aspects remain with the individuals that that person had a connection with.
And right, and that's a very common understanding, right, especially in sort of contemporary Jewish terms, right, of how do we understand immortality, right? We understand immortality in the sense that the parts of us that are left behind in other people, right? And what I was speaking about specifically was the experience of consciousness, right? Not what you were talking. I agree with you completely, right? But the experience of our own consciousness, right? We know that goes away when we die, but what follows, right? We don't know, right? If anything, right? But you're absolutely right? That when we die, right, we leave behind, and it was actually, again, I'm sorry that I keep on going back to this, but having just left the cemetery, the guy that we buried was somebody who didn't have a family.
Oh.
And there was a person who was there were two people who showed up who were connected to him by family. One of whom was a nephew, I think, and the other one was a cousin by marriage. And the person who was a cousin by marriage really didn't think that this person, it's not just that he didn't have a family, right? It was that she thought he didn't have any connections at all in the world, right? And so when she comes to the funeral and she sees all the people that did come to the funeral and all the people who talked about their connections with him, she was so reassured, right? And so comforted, right? That what you're talking about is true. So even if it's not a family member, right? That sense of leaving stuff behind is true. Yeah.
I brought a few things with me.
Great.
And after my husband died, I wish you had known him, Harriet. I wrote this. When my physical body goes, I will die, but everything else will survive. My soul will exist. It will include my legacy that will live on in the future. In Olam Haba, I won't be a corporeal body. I won't have eyes to see Marty, but we will be together because our souls will be together. My immortality will be achieved by my deeds, by my children and my grandchildren. I think Olam Haba is not a place, it's a time, etc., etc.
That's wonderful. That's beautiful.
And Marty and I took Talmud lessons with Rabbi Schultz. He believes strongly that the moment of poof, he believed that was a transition into the next dimension.
Yeah.
He believed strongly in dimensions.
Yes. Oh,
And so that, because he used to quote these physicians and scientists who died, who had immediately had another life.
oh, wow.
And wrote about it. I forget the name of that particular doctor.
That's so interesting. Well, there's a teaching from a rabbi that I read once, who said, imagine a baby in a womb, right? And you're in the womb and you're surrounded by amniotic fluid and you get all of your oxygen, and all of your sustenance from your mother, and life is good, right? There's nothing to worry about, right? And all of a sudden, right, the water breaks and there's this smushing and squishing and the fetus, what must the fetus be thinking, right? If a fetus could, I don't know if fetus is thinking that way, but oh my God, I'm being squeezed and this is it. This is the end. Right. And he says, well, how do we know, right, anymore when we're dying than the fetus knows when they're getting born, right? We don't know.
Rabbi Jim.
Go ahead, Ann.
Oh, okay. Oh, I just have I'm an atheist, but I've cheated a little bit by making up what's going to happen. And I'm going to go to the heaven I invented, and there will be all the people I love who've already died. So there's a positive thing about dying.
Yes.
It is definitely a delusion on my part, but it's,
Yeah, but it's a lovely thought.
yeah.
So I'm putting out a warning here that we have a little bit of a problem, which is that my computer is dying and I don't have the cord. So I'm gonna try to switch.
I have that equivalent cord upstairs.
Do you have a cord? It's a Dell. I don't know if it's the same one.
Did you ask your
I'm gonna
computer?
try to
how
put it on this
to-
computer, but this computer was not working before, so let's see what we can do.
Saying to myself.
Reminds me of the line
Good
in
job.
Go ahead, Arthur.
what, I forgot the name.
Could we just read through
Anyway.
the article?
Yeah, let's read through the article, and then if the computer dies, we'll still be on Zoom.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, it should
So
have.
let me, so, exactly. All right, we know that the fact of death is inescapable, and it has been so far, so for the nearly 2-year pandemic, right? As we begin another year, I'm astonished again and again to realize that more than 800,000 irreplaceable people have died from COVID-19 in the US. Worldwide, the number is over 5 million. When we hear about these numbers, it is important that we become attuned to actual deaths. The cessation of millions of consciousnesses stop just like that. This is not about how people have died, but that they have died. My father and I, like the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, came to view death as by no means something in general. It's not a general problem. Right? We understood that death is about me, about him, about you. But what we in fact were learning about was dying, not death. Differences be right.
That's
And I actually like that distinction, right?
Yeah.
Dying is a process. We get to count the days, but for me to die, there is no conscious self who recognizes that I am gone or that I was even here. I mean, again, we don't know, but I think it's reasonable to say from a sort of a basic scientific perspective, right? So yes, death, as my father put it, is too complex. It was February of 2020. Oh, so here it is. I mean, it's telling me when this happened. This was 2 years ago. That I wrote the introduction to a series of interviews that I would subsequently conduct for the Times philosophy series, The Stone, called Conversations on Death, with religious scholars from a variety of faiths. While my initial aim had little to do with grappling with the deaths caused by COVID-19, because at that point he had no idea, right? It soon became hard to ignore. Oh.
Professions, the baker and the milkman. So one is the rabbi. Kristen says, Rabbi, do you have a prayer for the czar? And the rabbi says, yes, my prayer is that he should be far away from us.
Right.
So what happened just now made me think, oh, is there a prayer for a dying computer?
There we go. There we go. All right. So Anne and Sandy, I hope you can still hear us. Can you still hear us?
I can see you and I can hear you.
Same with me.
Great. Okay, and I'm going to turn up the volume on this thing. Okay, and we're going to do our best. Okay.
Yeah, it's very impressive what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I wish I had been sufficiently impressive to remember to bring my power cord. But you know, we do what we can. All right. All right. So, as the interviews appeared, I heard from readers who said that reading them helped them cope with their losses during the pandemic. I would like to think that it was partly the probing of the meaning of death, the refusal to look away, that was helpful. And I think to a certain degree that was true for me, right? That it did seem very powerful to be able to have these conversations about death and to learn so much about the ways that different traditions learn about, think about death. Oh, good luck with that. Okay, there we go. Oh my gosh. We have a genius in the house. All right. All right. The only issue, let's see, Anne and Sandy, can you still hear me?
I can, yes, the answer is yes.
Thank you, Isaac. Okay. Right, I think that, right, that actually looking in the face of something that scares you, right, and actually approaching it and investigating it often makes it a little bit less scary, right? A little bit less daunting.
Or you get a heart attack.
Or you have a heart attack and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So while each scholar articulated a different interpretation of what happens after we die, it was not long before our conversations on death turned to matters of life. On the importance of what we do on this side of the grave. Death is a loss, each scholar seemed to say, but it also illuminates and transforms life and serves as a guide for the living. I think that there is real truth in that. And I think this is actually one thing that is, I don't know if this is what you're going to say, Connie.
No.
But the Conversation Project, I used to be involved with them. One of the things about the Conversation Project is that, you know, they would say again and again, right, that one of the benefits of actually addressing the topic of death is that it makes you talk about life and it brings you more into touch with what really matters to you.
Okay, so I was gonna bring up my granddaughter,
Yes.
who died 3 weeks ago, but she knew she was gonna die. That was her first essay that she wrote. What does it mean to be a 23-year-old and be told you have less than a year to live? And she and her family and her friends just made that year, less than a year, incredibly exciting, pleasant, worthwhile in all respects. She got a master's of social work during the year. She just traveled and she knew. It's another fact, she asked Jeremy, my son, what he was going to say. She assumed he was going to say eulogy because he did for Marty. So what was he going to say? Could she read it? I had it. And no, it's not going to be for a long time. I haven't even begun to think about it, etc. But that was a way of living with that knowledge.
100%. 100%. I mean, it's something just went through my. Oh, one of the beautiful things that you said about that is that she got a master's in social work, right? And I think that it's so often we think about, well, why do you go to school?
Yeah.
Why would a person get a master's in social work? The only reason to get a master's in social work is because you want to work as a social worker, right? It's only because of what you're going to be able to do later. But wait, what if you got your master's in social work because what you wanted was your master's in social work? And that was why you did it.
Or you wanted education.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. That it was about the learning. It was about the experience of doing that work, and that was the work that she was meant to do in the world, right? And to sort of recognize there's a real lesson in that, right? Of really focusing on where you are now, right? And not worrying about where you're going to be in 20 years, right? Because you're where you are now, and really focusing on that. So I think it's just amazing. But I mean, Rachel is such just such a story. The Buddhist scholar Dadul Namgyal stressed the importance of letting go of habits of self-obsession and attitudes of self-importance. Muli Vidas, a scholar of Judaism, placed more emphasis on Judaism's intellectual and spiritual energy. I have to confess, that was the other one that I didn't read, so I don't know if that one's good or not. Karen Thiel, a Roman Catholic, highlighted her interest in working toward making our world more just. That was a remarkable essay, definitely. The Jainism scholar Pankaj Jain underscored that it is on this side of the veil of death that one attempts to completely purify the soul through absolute non-violence. Druk Zitor, the scholar of Taoism, stressed the importance of embracing this life as constant change, being able to let go of allowing, as he says, every new situation to deliver us to its own new form as a new good. That is, I think, really a challenge, right? It's really a challenge to embrace all of the changes, right? Even the things that are terrible, and make that into something that's a new good, a new opportunity. How difficult that is, right? We all know from our own experience. Lior Halevi, a historian of Islam, told me that an imam would stress the importance of paying debts, giving to charity, and prayer.
Well, that's how we should live anyhow.
And exactly, right? And that sounds so Jewish to me, right? Make sure that you're not, make sure that you're not leaving stuff behind that you unfinished business. Right? Yeah. Oh, we lost Anne. That's too bad. And Jacob Kahinda Olupona, a scholar of the Yoruba religion, explained that humans are enjoined to do well in life so that when death eventually comes, one can be remembered for one's good deeds. Want to feel virtuous? One of my rabbis says, do virtuous things. The atheist philosopher Todd May placed importance on seeking to live our lives along two paths simultaneously, both looking forward and living fully in the present. The sheer variety of these insights raise the possibility that there are no absolute answers. The questions are too complex, and that life, as William Shakespeare's Macbeth says, is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I don't know. I don't think of Macbeth as a role model.
No, but he's funny.
Yes, he has his moments. He has his moments. There's a new movie of Macbeth, by the way.
It's supposed to be excellent.
I'm sorry.
It's supposed to be excellent.
And I heard it's very good. Yeah, I heard it's good. I mean, if Denzel Washington is something, usually, unless it's just a shoot 'em up. Perhaps we should think of death in terms of the parable of the blind man and the elephant, just as the blind man.
Francis McDormand.
Right.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, she's also, you can almost always count on her also.
Excellent. I like her better than that.
Perhaps we should think of death in terms of the parable of the blind man and the elephant, just as the blind men who come to know the elephant by touching only certain parts of it. Our views of death, religious or not, are limited, marked by context, culture, explicit and implicit metaphysical sensibilities, values, and vocabulary. The elephant evades full description, but with death, there doesn't seem to be anything to touch. There is just the fact that we die. Yet as human beings, we yearn to make sense of that about which we may not be able to capture in full. In this case, perhaps each religious worldview touches something or is touched by something beyond the grave, something that is beyond our descriptive limits. Perhaps for me, it is just too hard to let go. And so I refuse to accept that there is nothing after death. And I think this is, for him, I think this is true. This man is very freaked out by him. This attachment, which can function as a form of refusal, or an atheist, right, or a Jew who doesn't believe in any kind of an afterlife, would say denial, right? The recent death of a dear friend, my dear friend Bell Hooks, painfully demonstrates this. Why would I want to let go of our wonderful and caring relationship and our stimulating and witty conversations? I'm reminded, though, that my father's last words regarding the meaning of death being too complex leave me facing a beautiful question. My father was also a lover of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. He would quote sections from it verbatim. I wasn't there when my father stopped breathing, but I wish I could have spoken these lines by Gibran as he left us. And what is it to cease breathing, but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may rise and expand and seek God on its own. Beautiful. That's a beautiful quotation. I haven't heard it.
I can quote. I used to quote, I feel he brought to my mother.
Use the microphone.
I used to quote, "He'll be brought to my mother.
Oh, that's great.
Your children come from you, but not on you. They have to leave you."
spoken like a true daughter. In this past year of profound loss and grief, it is hard to find comfort. No matter how many philosophers or theologians seek the answers, the meaning of death remains a mystery. And yet silence in the face of this mystery is not an option for me, as it wasn't for my father, perhaps because we know that while we may find solace in our rituals, it is also in the seeking that we must persist. So we read through it. So faster than we would want to, but on the other hand, it's 3 minutes before 4, so we have to close. So I open the floor to comments and reactions, but I also want to sort of ask the question: is this a series that this group would like to pursue and look at some of these articles, as a kind of, on one hand, an exploration of death, but also on the other hand, an exploration of the different ways that a variety of traditions. And again, he talks to one scholar of each tradition, and of course, each of these traditions is as diverse as the diversity of the traditions that he talks about. So the one Catholic person he talks to, of course, is just her way of looking at it, right? There's probably a whole range of them. So, with that limitation in mind, right? Does that sound interesting? I see some heads going up and down. I don't see anyone saying no, but if you don't want to do it, then of course you just won't comment. Go ahead, Barbara.
I'd be interested in it. I'd like to read the interviews actually from this article.
Right.
We can send the.
Well, that's what I was thinking, is we could start with his introduction and sort of get a sense of his sort of anxieties about death. And I think one of the questions we sort of began there today, right? Sort of with, well, what are some of our thoughts about death? And why might he have some of those thoughts, right? From Ruth, like, oh, I didn't want to focus on the fact that he was dying, right? To other people who might have a very different, like Rachel, right? It was like, I know that I'm going to be dead in a year, and so I'm going to live the life that I want now, because I know that, unlike a lot of people, I can't sort of be planning for the future, so I'm going to live like this. Yeah, go ahead.
Through the mask.
Through the mask.
Through the mask. I really would like to continue this discussion. I feel that a good part of my life has been involved with death. I had young family members, and for some reason, because of, I don't know why, I was the one that cleaned out what was left
And I can remember so very clearly. And then professionally, it's never professional. I was always dealing with death. Now I have found in the last 2 years that I'm somewhat obsessed with making it my death the right way for my family. And one of the crazy things that I do is I throw things out a lot. So they don't have to go through what I went through. So for me, death is just an everyday consciousness. I just always think of it. And the only time, and a little time I got relief was I was in the car with one of my grandsons who was then 10 years old. And someone else was dying in the family. And Jonathan said to me, Grandma, what am I going to do when you die? You won't be here. And I said, but I'm going to be in your heart. And just like a 10-year-old, he said, oh, okay. That was the end of it. If I could make the end of these discussions.
Hi, Jill. I'm in the middle of a meeting. I'll call you back.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I love it. What I love about that is that that's a perfect 10-year-old response, right? This like, great, exactly, this great fear, right? Is great, anxiety about what, and then you allay that anxiety and he's completely fine. Because he knows, oh yeah, part of you will always be with me, even if you're not here. And he got it. He got it. Right. Well, right. I mean, some things are maybe a little bit easier for a 10-year-old. All right. Any final? We're at time. I apologize for keeping us a little bit over.
It's all too complicated.
It's too complex. That's what George Yancey's father said. He was right. But it's too complex, and it still helps to talk about it. So.
It's important to talk about it. Life is complex.
Life is right. Death is too complex, and life is too complex. You don't ignore it.
Just on a funny note, there was an actress called Rosanna Dana, and if you remember her.
Oh, yeah.
And she said, it's always something, always something. So whenever.
Gilda Radner.
Gilda Radner.
Yes, Gilda Radner. It's always something.
She was great.
Yeah.
Gilda Radner was amazing.
Died too young.
Yeah.
She also wrote a book for that time.
And she was great. All right, Barbara, you get the last word.
Bruce, it is very complex, but I think the more we talk about it, the less complex it becomes.
I'll let you know.
So sorry, Barbara. Ruth got the last word. All right, thank you all very much. So next week.
Yeah.
Just pay it. Look, next week we are having Jonathan Quint is going to be coming and talking about sustainability and corporate responsibility in the context of sustainability, and then we will pick up this. We'll pick up this topic either 2 weeks from today or 3 weeks from today, depending on how things work out. Okay, so pay attention to the bulletins. And to my emails if you get the emails. I'll hopefully I'll be able to sort of broadcast what the topics are in advance. I'll do my best.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. Thank you, Sandy.
And thank you.